Hey guys, today we've got another exciting game of Revised 40. This time we've got myself on the left playing my black-green rock deck, and my opponent Christopher on the right side playing his blue-red Counterburn deck. Christopher is on the play this game, and he is going to lead with a mountain and passes the turn back to me. I go for a forest and a birds of paradise, which quickly eats a lightning bolt from Christopher's side. Even in Revised 40, you should always bolt the bird. Christopher plays a land and passes the turn back to me. I play a swamp into a dark ritual, adding 3 black for a hypnotic specter. If Christopher doesn't have a lightning bolt for this hypnotic specter, it's going to quickly start eating away at his hand, making him discard things like counterspells so that I can resolve some of my larger threats. It doesn't look like he has a bolt, so hypnotic specter gets in there for 2, and is going to force Christopher to discard a card at random. After that swing, I pass the turn back to Christopher. And he goes with a Brain Geyser for 2. So possibly looking for another mountain or maybe a lightning bolt to deal with this Hypnotic Spectre. I get in for another 2 damage, putting my opponent down to 16 and forcing him to discard another card. Looks like a Power Sink. On my second main phase, I go with a Soul Ring, and then tap 5 mana to cast a Cockatrice.
You.
This is an interesting rare from Revised. It is a 5 mana 2/4 flyer, which doesn't have the keyword Death Touch, but that's essentially how it ends up reading. Cockatrice is a really good aerial attacker and stops some larger creatures from my opponent's side from attacking. Christopher goes for an unsummon on my Hypnotic Spectre so that he doesn't discard a card and only takes 2 from the Cockatrice. I tap 3 mana and recast the Hippie, and then pass the turn. Christopher now has access to 6 mana, so we'll see if we see something like a Mahamoti Djinn come down. But nope, looks like a Disintegrate for 2, which would kill my Hypnotic Spectre. And it looks like that is what happens, so Hypnotic Spectre is killed, and because it was destroyed with a Disintegrate, it is going to get exiled. On my turn, I swing in for 2, taking Christopher down to 12 life. And then tapping 5 for a Sengir Vampire, another really aggressive flying creature. It is a 5 mana 4/4 flyer. That's one of the features of this deck, is it has a lot of flying creatures, but it looks like Christopher has a pretty good answer with this Mahamoti Djinn.
Knock, knock.
The Djinn is a 5/6 flyer and can easily block my Sengir Vampire. Remember, the Cockatrice does have a pseudo Death Touch effect, so I swing with both creatures, possibly signaling that I have a Giant Growth to my opponent. My opponent takes the damage, I play another Vampire and pass the turn back.
This is getting out of hand. Now there are 2 of them.
Go into combat again, I swing for 10 damage. We'll see if my opponent has an unsummon or some way to handle all these flying threats. And it doesn't look like he does, so the first game goes to black-green rock. Heading into game number 2, my opponent on the right side is going to be on the play there. So we'll see what kind of a start both players have. My opponent goes with an Ion and passes back. I go again with the forest into birds of paradise. Doesn't look like it's going to eat a lightning bolt this time. We'll see if I have a turn 2 Hypnotic Spectre. It doesn't look like it, but my opponent has a Serendib Efreet. This is a really powerful flyer, so I instantly use Terror to destroy it. Serendib really efficiently blocks most creatures and also gets in for a lot of damage. On my turn, I go for a War Mammoth, which is a 3/3 Trampler. My opponent on his turn looks like he has another Serendib Efreet. This blocks my War Mammoth really well unless I have something like a Giant Growth. So I go to combat and swing with the Mammoth. Christopher blocks, and it looks like I do have the Giant Growth. So 2 damage tramples over, taking my opponent down to 18. Christopher taps 5 mana and goes with an Earth Elemental. This is a really big ground creature from Revised. It is a 4/5 vanilla. So it blocks the War Mammoth pretty efficiently, and I have already used one of my giant growths. So we'll see what I can do about this here. Looks like a regrowth, getting back Terror. And that Terror is going to kill the Earth Elemental so that my Mammoth can continue to get in for damage. And it does, taking Christopher down to 15. Passing the turn back, my opponent goes for another Earth Elemental. Back on my turn, I swing for 3. Again, signaling I might have a giant growth in hand. And I play another Sengir Vampire. So it's going to get pretty tricky for my opponent to block these creatures unless he can find something like a Djinn or a way to kill my larger threats. My opponent swings for 4. I of course don't block with the Sengir, taking me down to 16. And then follows it up with a Disintegrate for 4 on my Sengir Vampire, which is going to exile it. So with the Sengir down, he passes the turn back. I go to combat and swing for 3 with the War Mammoth, taking my opponent down to just 9 life. And on my second main phase, I cast a Hypnotic Spectre. Still haven't seen any lightning bolts this game from Christopher, so very possible that he has a response to either of my threats. But more than likely it's going to be the Hypnotic Spectre, since it's going to eat away slowly at his hand. I go for a Terror on the Earth Elemental, which is countered by Christopher.
Hasta la vista, baby.
On my turn, swinging with the team, again signaling I'll probably have a giant growth here in a minute. And it looks like I do, but Christopher has the lightning bolt, so gets the 2-for-1 on me there, bolting the mammoth before the giant growth has a chance to resolve.
I did not see that coming!
Really good play by Christopher there. Hypnotic Spectre connects, and my opponent is forced to discard what looks like a power sink there, and I pass the turn back. My opponent gets in for 4 damage, taking me down to 12, and passes the turn. On my turn, I swing for 2 damage, and make that 5 damage with a giant growth. But it looks like Christopher has a response. He goes for a Spell Blast on the Lightning Bolt. So the Hypnotic Spectre gets in for 2 and takes Christopher down to 5. He discards a counterspell to it. Earth Elemental gets in for 4. And then Disintegrate takes care of the Hypnotic Spectre. On my turn, I cast a Demonic Tutor and get to go look for an answer or a threat. I tap 1 and play a Dark Ritual, and then cast a Cockatrice. More than likely the card that I tutored off of this Demonic Tutor, since it can really efficiently block this Earth Elemental, which it does. Cockatrice does have pseudo Death Touch, so both creatures are going to be killed in combat there. And now both players are on top decks. Neither one of us really have any threats, so it's just who can find the largest flying creature first is probably going to take down this game. On my side, I'm looking for things like Sengir Vampire, and on my opponent's side, looking for a Mahamoti Djinn or something like a Shivan Dragon. So on my turn, I go to combat and attack with a Bird of Paradise, which I giant growth, but it does get unsummoned by my opponent. So I recast it and pass the turn. My opponent goes for a Mahamoti Djinn. This is going to be a real problem for me since it is going to kill me in just 2 hits. But I have a couple of Birds of Paradise to block, so we'll see if I can buy myself enough time to find an answer. Christopher swings for 5, and I chump block with my Bird of Paradise. On my turn, tapping 4 for a Jayamday Tome, which unfortunately is countered by a Power Sink, so that's going to force me to tap out of all my lands. Not going to be able to draw any extra cards to look for Sengir Vampires. My opponent gets in for 5, and I block again with my Bird of Paradise. Back on my turn, looks like I have a Soul Ring, but still no threat. My opponent gets in for 5, which I cannot block this time. I am now in Lightning Bolt range, so we'll see if my opponent can just finish me off here. And it looks like I do not find any answers, so Christopher takes down game number 2. Moving into game number 3, I'm going to be on the play on the left side of things. This is the tiebreaker, so we'll see what happens in this game. Looks like I have another Forest into Birds of Paradise. Probably one of the best openers for this deck outside of Dark Ritual into Hypnotic Spectre. So there we do see a Dark Ritual, and it is used to cast a Sengir Vampire. So a 5-mana play on turn 2 from the Birds of Paradise and Dark Ritual.
Fun will now commence.
Sengir gets in for 4 damage. And I follow it up with nothing and pass the turn back to my opponent. My opponent passes the turn back. I play a land and swing for 4, taking my opponent down to 12. My opponent still hasn't found a mountain, so it's going to be very hard to deal with this Sengir Vampire. Christopher goes for a Serendib Efreet, which is only a 3/4, so it can't block the Sengir without something like a Lightning Bolt to finish it off. So my opponent takes the damage, and I cast a Hypnotic Spectre. Hypnotic Spectre is counterspelled. Serendib deals a damage to my opponent on their upkeep. And taps out for a big Brain Geyser here, this one for 4. So possibly looking for a mountain, and there it is. So now I have to be worried about a block from the Serendib Efreet combined with a Lightning Bolt to take out my Sengir Vampire. I decide to go for the attack anyway. And it looks like Christopher does have a Lightning Bolt.
I even know what you're thinking right now!
That's impossible. No one can guess what I'm thinking.
But thankfully I have a Giant Growth on my side, which is going to ensure that my vampire stays alive. I cast a Bird of Paradise. And tap 2 mana for a Demonic Tutor. This could get anything from a Mind Twist to another Sengir Vampire, or even just a Giant Growth to try and push through for lethal next turn. Sengir Vampire gets a counter on it since it killed a creature last turn. And my opponent taps a lot of mana here. We'll see if it's a Mahamoti Djinn. And it looks like it's a Disintegrate for 5, which is going to exile my Sengir Vampire. So not as scary as a Mahamoti Djinn, but still pretty good for my opponent. I now don't have any attackers, but I do still have a card from the Demonic Tutor that I have not cast. And it looks like it might have been the Sengir Vampire. That would be a really strong card to tutor up, as just a 4/4 difficult to handle threat, since my opponent is only at 7. My opponent goes for a Serendib Efreet and passes the turn back. On my turn, I tap 3 for a Hypnotic Spectre. Still have to be worried about the Lightning Bolt block combo, but it looks like the Hypnotic Spectre gets countered with a Spell Blast. I decide to go ahead and Regrowth. Regrowth takes any card from my graveyard and puts it back into my hand. And it does resolve, so it's going to put a Giant Growth back in my hand. This will ensure that the Sengir Vampire can't be killed by a Lightning Bolt and a block. Christopher goes for the Lightning Bolt, so I respond with a Giant Growth, putting a counter on Sengir Vampire since the Serendib Efreet did die, and I pass the turn back. My opponent has an Earth Elemental, which unfortunately doesn't fly, so can't be used to block the Sengir. I go to combat and swing for 5, putting my opponent down to 2. A Giant Growth would be lethal at this point, but it looks like I don't have it. So my opponent gets one more turn to try and find an answer. Back on my turn, I swing for 5, and my opponent has an Unsummon, which is going to return my vampire to my hand. Recasting it, we'll see if my opponent has a counterspell. And it looks like he does, has a Power Sink. So that Power Sink is going to force me to counter the spell unless I pay a lot of mana, which I do not have. And I pass the turn back. My opponent swings for 4 with the Earth Elemental and passes the turn back. Back on my turn, I tap 4 for a War Mammoth. This Mammoth is only a 3/3, so it can't quite make it through the Earth Elemental even though it does have Trample. But something like a Giant Growth could potentially let it deal some extra damage. My opponent obviously not going to swing since the War Mammoth is lethal at this point. After a couple passes back and forth, I go ahead and swing with the War Mammoth, which of course Christopher has to block, and I go for a Giant Growth, but unfortunately my opponent has an unsummon, so the Mammoth is returned to my hand. I recast it and it gets counterspelled. Really good play by my opponent there, unsummoning the Mammoth and then countering it on the way back down. Christopher gets in for 4 and passes the turn back. On my turn I go for a Cockatrice, which is a 2/4 flyer, so it is lethal if my opponent can't unsummon it or kill it with some kind of burn spell. And that is enough to do it, so the black-green rock deck takes down the game over the blue-red Counterburn deck. I hope you guys enjoyed watching that game. I know I enjoyed playing it. If you do want to check out the entire deck list, it's up on screen now, or you can check it out down in the description box. If you like this video and want to see more Revised 40 content, be sure to click the subscribe button and check out the Revised 40 playlist. Thanks for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.